X wants a paternity test after abandoning us, says one of our twins isn't his. All right, let me start this off by saying this whole situation with my ex, Alex, is a complete mess, and it's honestly been one thing after another since we split. Like, I thought things were rough when he left me while I was pregnant with the twins, but that was just the beginning. Now he's come up with the most ridiculous demand yet. He wants a paternity test for our youngest, Lila. And the reason? Apparently she doesn't look like him, so now he's convinced I cheated on him and that she's not his. Let me back up a bit and explain. Alex and I were together for a few years, and things seemed fine until they weren't. When I got pregnant with the twins, Luke and Lila, he started pulling away. Like, emotionally distancing himself, barely helping with anything, and constantly finding reasons to stay late at work. I should have seen the signs, but I was too busy dealing with the pregnancy and trying to keep everything together. By the time I was about 6 months along, he dropped the bomb. He was leaving. Just like that, he was gone. He didn't even stick around to see the birth. I had to do everything on my own, which was hard enough. Luke came out looking like a mini version of Alex, no denying that. But Lila, she's got darker hair, curls, and her features are a little different. She looks more like my grandmother, who was mixed race and white passing. I didn't think much of it at first. Babies can look all sorts of ways. But apparently, Alex, and more importantly, his new wife Fiona, are making a big deal out of it. Fiona, man, I could write a whole book on her. She's the woman Alex left me for, and from the moment she came into the picture, she's been trying to shove her way into my kids' lives, acting like she's their mother or something. The kids don't like her, which makes sense because, let's be real, who would like the woman your dad left your mom for? Fiona's always trying to get them to call her mama, and they flat out refuse. I don't even have to say anything. The kids are old enough to see through the BS. So, fast forward to now. The twins are 5, and suddenly Alex is hitting me up, saying Lila isn't his. At first, I thought it was a joke. Like, dude, she's your daughter. You were there. Well, not physically there, but you get what I mean. We were still married when she was born, and your name's on the birth certificate. But now, all of a sudden, because Fiona doesn't think Lila looks like him or Luke, he's pushing for a paternity test. Yeah, this is totally Fiona's doing, no doubt. What really pisses me off is that Alex never had a problem paying child support before. He's always done it, though I know it's not out of the goodness of his heart. It's more because he didn't want to get in trouble with the courts. But lately, he's been trying to cut down on the amount, claiming he's struggling financially. Uh-huh, sure. Maybe if he didn't blow all his money on his latest hobby, whatever expensive nonsense he's into now, he wouldn't have that issue. Anyway, I found out about this whole paternity thing from his sister Maggie before Alex even bothered to tell me. Maggie's been my ally in all this. She's the only one from Alex's side who still talks to me. She let me know that Alex and Fiona have been going around telling people that they want a paternity test for Lila, and that he's planning to stop paying child support if it turns out she's not his. She also let slip that they've been having money problems again, which I kind of already suspected because he stopped taking the kids on his weekends. He's claiming it's because he has to work overtime, but I know it's more than that. I confronted Alex about it, and his excuse was laughable. Lila doesn't look like me or you, he said. Like, dude, genetics are wild. Not every kid is going to be your clone. I even brought up my grandmother, but he didn't care. His mind is made up that I must have cheated on him, and now he's paying for another man's child. I told him straight up that if he wants a paternity test, he's going to have to take me to court. I'm not going to let him bully me into anything. I know he's just trying to weasel out of paying for his own kid, and I'm not here for it. He tried pulling the I can't afford court card, acting like I'm holding his money hostage by forcing him to pay for a kid that isn't his. Yeah, right. But it gets worse. After I told him to take me to court, he started blasting me all over Facebook. I don't follow him, but Maggie sent me screenshots. He's out there telling anyone who will listen that I tricked him into signing the birth certificate and that I'm forcing him to pay for a child that isn't his. I swear the man is delusional. He wasn't even at the hospital when Lila was born, but because we were still married, his name went on the certificate automatically. Now he's acting like I forged it or something. And of course, his Facebook rants have attracted a whole bunch of his idiot friends who think they know everything. One of them even had the nerve to message me, telling me I should just get the paternity test to clear my name and make things easier for Alex. Yeah, because I'm the one making things difficult here. Unbelievable. I've started ignoring his calls altogether. If he wants to talk to me, it has to be through text or email so I can have everything documented. I don't trust him not to twist things. I've learned my lesson after dealing with his crap for years. Plus, I'm pretty sure this whole thing isn't even about Lila not being his. It's about money. It's always about money with him. Fiona's probably in his ear telling him to cut his losses and stop paying child support. At this point, I'm so tired of dealing with his nonsense. He left when I was pregnant, barely sees the kids, and now he's trying to rewrite history by claiming one of them isn't his. It's pathetic, really. But if he thinks I'm going to roll over and let him off the hook, he's got another thing coming. I'll fight him on this. Court or no court. I'm not about to let him or Fiona push me around. They can spread all the lies they want, but I know the truth. And deep down, so does Alex. So yeah, that's where we're at. I guess now I just wait for him to either back off or take me to court. Honestly, I'm kind of hoping for the latter. Let's see him try to explain this whole mess in front of a judge. Alright, so things took a turn after that whole paternity test situation with Alex. I thought maybe, just maybe, after the way I shut him down in the last conversation, he'd cool off and think things through. I mean, logically, if I didn't cheat on him, and I didn't, there's no point dragging this mess out, right? But of course, Alex doesn't think logically. He thinks like a victim, and when he's backed into a corner, he lashes out. This time, he didn't come to me directly. Oh no, he's way too much of a coward for that. Instead, he and Fiona went on a full-blown smear campaign against me. It started small, like little jabs on social media, subtle things only people close to us would understand. But then, it escalated fast. He wasn't content with just dragging me online. He had to start bringing family into it. One day I got a call from his dad, Phil. Now, I actually like Phil. He's always been fair with me, even after the divorce. He's great with the kids and has never let Alex's drama get in the way of his relationship with them. So, when he called me, I figured it was just a normal check-in. I wasn't expecting him to be all worked up, practically yelling about the ridiculous stuff Alex had been saying about me to the family. Apparently, Alex had been going around telling everyone that I was cheating on him for the last 2 years of our marriage. 2 years. And not just with some random guy either. He said I had an affair with my former coworker, Steve. First of all, Steve is married with kids, and we were literally just coworkers. We barely even talked outside of work. Second, Alex left me, so this whole cheating thing he's claiming is just insane. Phil knew it was all nonsense, but Alex had been spreading this crap to everyone, including Phil's side of the family. So now, I had to do damage control with the in-laws, who were suddenly thinking there might be more to Alex's story than I was letting on. It's funny how quickly people are willing to believe the worst about you when they're not the ones directly involved. Some of them reached out to me, acting all concerned but really just fishing for more dirt. You know the type, the ones who pretend they care but just want something to gossip about. And then there was Fiona. Oh boy, she's really loving this. She's jumping in, backing up every word Alex says, acting like she's been in the picture longer than 5 minutes. I get that she doesn't like me. Obviously, we were never going to be friends. But this was a whole new level of petty. She even went so far as to tell people that I was trying to trap Alex by getting pregnant with the twins. Like, what? I didn't plan for him to leave me while I was pregnant. I didn't want any of this. But in her twisted mind, I guess it makes sense to blame me for everything that went wrong. To make things worse, Alex started posting cryptic updates on Facebook, the kind where he doesn't name names, but everyone knows who he's talking about. Stuff like, some people are finally getting exposed for who they really are, and can't wait for the truth to come out. He'd reply to comments from his friends like, you'll see soon enough, with a bunch of winky face emojis. It was ridiculous, but I couldn't help but get pissed off every time someone sent me a screenshot. Then, out of nowhere, one of Alex's friends, who I barely know, messages me. He says something like, hey, you should really just get the paternity test, it'll shut everyone up. As if it's just that simple. I wanted to throw my phone across the room. It's not just about the test. It's about the principle. Alex can't just accuse me of cheating because his life isn't going the way he wants. I don't owe him a damn thing, and I sure as hell don't owe Fiona any peace of mind. But this is where things got even crazier. Alex didn't just stop at talking crap about me and pushing for a paternity test. Oh no, he decided to take it up a notch and involve Luke and Lila in this mess. He didn't come to pick them up for his scheduled weekend, which wasn't surprising because he'd been flaking a lot lately. But when I called to ask what was going on, he actually had the nerve to tell me, I'm not taking Lila until you prove she's mine. I was speechless for a second. He was really doing this? Punishing our daughter because of some stupid idea he got into his head? I told him straight up, you don't get to pick and choose which kids you take based on your mood. But he didn't care. He doubled down, saying he wouldn't take her until the test was done. I lost it. I told him, fine, if you don't want to be a dad to Lila, you don't get to be a dad to Luke either. I'm not playing these games with him. I refuse to let him mess with the kids' heads like that, making them think they're only worthy of love if they meet some arbitrary standard he's set. If he's going to be in their lives, he's going to be in both of their lives. But Alex didn't take it seriously. He laughed it off and hung up on me. After that, I called Phil again, explained what happened, and like I expected, he was furious with Alex. He said he'd talk to him, but I knew it wouldn't change much. Alex is stubborn, and once Fiona's got him convinced of something, there's no reasoning with him. The worst part? Luke started asking questions. He's only 5, but kids are smart. He could tell something was off when Alex didn't show up. He asked me why Daddy didn't want to see them, and I had to sit there and try to explain in the simplest way possible without making it sound like Alex was abandoning them. I told him that Daddy was busy, but we'd see him soon. But Luke didn't look convinced, and it broke my heart. I could already see the long-term damage this could do to the kids, and it made me hate Alex even more. All I ever wanted was for them to have a healthy relationship with their dad, and he's the one screwing it up because of his ego. Lila, thank God, is still too young to understand any of this, but I know the day will come when she asks why her dad acted the way he did. And what am I supposed to tell her? That her dad didn't want to see her because he thought she wasn't his? That's a conversation I never should have to have with my daughter. So now here we are. Alex is still holding this stupid paternity test over my head, and I'm just trying to keep things as normal as possible for the kids. It's exhausting. Every day feels like a new fight, and I'm just waiting for the next ridiculous stunt Alex and Fiona pull. But one thing's for sure, I'm not backing down. If he wants to take this to court, fine. But until then, he's not getting away with this crap. Update 1. Alright, so here's where things took a real turn. After Alex decided he wasn't going to see the kids until I agreed to a paternity test for Lila, I thought things couldn't get worse. I figured, okay, maybe he'll cool off, realize he's being a total idiot, and stop dragging the kids into this. But nah, Alex doesn't know how to just let things go. Instead of calming down, he went even further into crazy territory. Out of nowhere, I get a message from Maggie, Alex's sister. She's always been straight with me, and honestly, she's the only one from his family that's kept in contact after all this drama started. So Maggie texts me, saying that Alex and Fiona are planning to sue me for full custody of Luke. That's right, just Luke. Apparently they've decided that since Lila isn't his, they don't want anything to do with her. But Luke? Oh, he's definitely Alex's in their twisted logic, so they want him all to themselves. I swear, when I read that message, my brain just shut down for a second. I didn't even know what to think. How do you decide you're only going to fight for one of your kids? And how does that even make sense? But Alex is the king of terrible decisions, and I guess this one was no different. So I called Maggie right away to get the details. She tells me that Alex has been telling people that I'm mentally unstable, and that I can't handle raising both kids on my own. Now, if anyone's been keeping track here, Alex has barely been around since he left me when I was pregnant. I've been doing everything solo, and the kids are doing great. But now he's trying to paint this picture like I'm some unfit mom just because he wants to get Luke away from me. Maggie said she overheard Fiona talking about how they're going to make me look like I've been neglecting the kids and that it's in Luke's best interest to live with them. Fiona doesn't even know Luke. Let's be real. Every time the kids have come back from their weekends with Alex, they've told me how Fiona barely talks to them unless it's to boss them around. She's no mother figure, no matter how much she wants to play the part. After I got off the phone with Maggie, I just sat there for a minute, fuming. I knew Alex was petty, but this was next-level garbage. I could feel myself getting worked up, and all I could think about was how much damage this would do to Luke if they actually went through with it. How do you explain to a 5-year-old that his dad only wants him and not his sister? How do you keep him from feeling guilty, like it's somehow his fault? I decided to take matters into my own hands. I wasn't going to sit around and wait for Alex to throw the first punch in this custody fight. I started documenting everything. I had already been keeping records of our conversations, but now I made sure to include every little detail. I even kept notes on the days he skipped his weekends with the kids. If he was going to play dirty, I was going to be ready. But before I could even get too far into preparing for this custody nonsense, Alex pulled another move. He showed up at my house. I kid you not. He just knocked on my door like we were still on speaking terms or something. The second I saw him standing there, I knew something was up. He had that smug, I'm about to stir up trouble look on his face. "What do you want?" I asked, already annoyed before he even opened his mouth. He didn't waste any time getting to the point. "I'm here to talk about Luke," he said. "We need to figure out a new arrangement because clearly you can't handle both kids." I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, but I tried to stay calm. "What are you talking about, Alex? I've been handling everything just fine. You're the one who can't even stick to your weekends." He smirked like he was enjoying every second of this. "I think it's best for Luke to come live with me and Fiona full-time. He deserves a stable home, and well, let's just say you're not exactly providing that." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You think taking Luke away from his sister is providing stability? Are you serious right now?" Alex shrugged like it was no big deal. Lila isn't my kid, so why should I care? Luke needs his father, not to be stuck in your mess. I lost it. My mess? You walked out on us. You're the one who's been barely involved in their lives, and now you want to take Luke and pretend like you're father of the year? Get real, Alex. He crossed his arms, clearly enjoying how much he was getting under my skin. I've already talked to my lawyer. We're filing for custody. I'm not asking you. I'm telling you. At that point, I knew there was no reasoning with him. He had it in his head that he was going to win, that he could just swoop in and take Luke away from me without a second thought. I slammed the door in his face, which I'll admit, felt pretty satisfying. The next day I contacted a lawyer of my own. I wasn't about to let Alex waltz in and take my son from me. We started going over the details of the case, and my lawyer reassured me that I had a solid case. Alex's lack of involvement, his refusal to take Lila, and his attempt to use custody as a way to hurt me were all going to work against him. And guess what? The cherry on top? Alex didn't even have the money to go through with his custody case. Maggie told me later that he'd been bluffing, trying to scare me into giving up Luke without an actual court battle. He hadn't even hired a lawyer. He just wanted to intimidate me. Typical Alex move. So after all that, nothing really came of his little custody stunt. But the damage was already done. Luke and Lila could sense the tension, and I hated that they were being dragged into this. It wasn't fair to them, and I knew it was only a matter of time before Alex tried something else to stir up more trouble. For now, though, I've got my guard up. I'm documenting everything, keeping records, and making sure I'm prepared for whatever Alex and Fiona try to pull next. I'm not backing down, and I'm not going to let them mess with my kids' lives any more than they already have. It's exhausting, but at this point, I don't have a choice. It's just another day dealing with Alex's crap, but I'm ready for whatever comes next. Update 2. So, after all the chaos with Alex trying to get custody of Luke and failing miserably, you'd think things would calm down, right? I mean, how many times can one guy screw up his own life? Turns out, the answer is as many times as it takes for him to feel like a victim. And this time, he went to a whole new level of ridiculous. It started when Luke came home from a weekend with Alex and Fiona, and I could tell something was off right away. Normally, Luke is pretty talkative when he gets back, telling me about everything he did. Usually, it's stuff like going to the park or playing video games. But this time, he was quiet, almost like he was nervous or scared. I tried to ask him how the weekend was, but he just shrugged and said, "It was okay." That's when I knew something was up. Later that evening, when I was putting him to bed, I asked again, "Luke, is something bothering you? You've been really quiet today." And finally, he opened up. He looked down at his blanket and mumbled, "Daddy said that Lila isn't my real sister." I swear I felt my heart drop. "What do you mean, Luke?" He glanced up at me with those big, innocent eyes and said, "He said that Lila doesn't belong in our family because she doesn't look like him." I could barely keep it together. Alex had actually told our 5-year-old son that his sister wasn't really his sister. The anger I felt in that moment was like nothing I'd ever experienced before. I had to take a deep breath because I didn't want to scare Luke, but inside I was ready to explode. "Luke," I said, trying to stay calm, "Lila is your sister. She's your twin. You both grew inside my belly at the same time. You'll always be family, no matter what anyone says." He nodded, but I could tell he was still confused. How could he not be? His own dad was planting doubts in his head, and it wasn't fair. It wasn't fair to Luke, and it definitely wasn't fair to Lila. After I got Luke settled down for the night, I sat on the couch, fuming. I knew I needed to confront Alex about this, but part of me was dreading it because I knew it was just going to be another fight. Still, I couldn't let him get away with filling our son's head with lies. I grabbed my phone and fired off a text to him. "We need to talk. What the hell did you tell Luke about Lila?" I didn't expect him to respond right away, but my phone buzzed almost immediately. Of course, he denied everything, saying, "I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't say anything like that." Classic Alex. Deny, deny, deny. I wasn't buying it, though. Luke had no reason to make something like that up. I told Alex as much, and all he could do was deflect, saying I was probably confusing Luke by treating Lila like his sister when everyone knows she's not. That was it for me. I called him, and when he picked up, I didn't even let him get a word in before I laid into him. "How dare you say something like that to our son? What kind of father tries to turn their kid against his own sister?" Alex tried to play it off, acting all casual like he wasn't doing something horribly manipulative. I was just telling him the truth. He's old enough to understand that Lila isn't really part of my family. I could barely contain my rage. "She's part of your family whether you like it or not. You're on her birth certificate. You've been paying child support for her since day one. Stop trying to mess with Luke's head just because you don't want to face reality." He started to argue back, but I cut him off. You're not taking Luke or Lila until you stop this. I'm done with you trying to poison them against each other. That shut him up for a second. But then he pulled his usual victim act. Oh, so now you're going to keep the kids from me? Nice. Real mature. I wasn't going to let him twist things around. No, I'm not keeping them from you. I'm protecting them from your nonsense. If you can't be a decent father to both of them, then you don't deserve to see either of them. He hung up on me after that, which was fine. I wasn't in the mood to listen to more of his excuses anyway, but I knew this wasn't over. Alex wasn't the type to just drop something, and I had a feeling he'd come back with something even worse. Sure enough, the next weekend rolled around, and Alex didn't show up to pick up the kids. I wasn't surprised, but it still hurt, especially for Luke. He had been excited to see his dad, even after what happened, because he's 5 and doesn't fully understand what's going on. But when I had to tell him that Daddy wasn't coming, the look on his face nearly broke me. He just stared at me for a second, then nodded like he was trying to act tough. It's okay, Mommy, he said, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. That night, I sat down and wrote out everything that had happened. I knew I needed to have this all documented in case Alex tried to pull some legal stunt again. I wasn't going to let him get away with this, but I also needed to be smart about it. I couldn't just fly off the handle every time he did something awful, even though I really, really wanted to. The next week, Alex finally texted me, acting like nothing had happened. Can I pick up Luke this weekend? He wrote, not even mentioning Lila. I didn't even hesitate before replying. You pick up both of them or none of them. I'm not playing your games. Of course, that set him off, and he tried to argue that he wasn't ready to deal with Lila until the paternity test was done, but I stood my ground. You don't get to decide when you're ready to be a father. You either are or you're not. I could tell by his response that he wasn't happy with my ultimatum, but at this point, I didn't care. I wasn't going to let him keep pulling this crap. If he didn't want to step up and be a dad to both of his kids, then I was perfectly fine handling things on my own. I'd been doing it since day one anyway. So here we are. I haven't heard from Alex in a few days, which is actually kind of a relief. But I know this isn't the end of it. He'll be back with some new plan, some new excuse, but I'll be ready. I'm done letting him mess with my kids' lives, and I'm definitely not letting him get away with treating Lila like she doesn't belong. We're a family, all 3 of us, and nothing Alex says or does is going to change that. Update 3. All right, so here we are. After everything that's gone down, you'd think Alex would finally get the hint and just stop with his nonsense, right? But no, that's not how he works. Just when I thought he couldn't go any lower, he finds a way to surprise me. I should have known better by now. This time, though, he really crossed a line. It started with another text from Maggie. By now, she's my go-to for all the dirt on Alex, and honestly, she's probably the only person in his life who still has a shred of common sense. So when I got a message from her on a random Tuesday afternoon, I knew it wasn't going to be good. She told me Alex and Fiona were planning something big, something legal. Apparently, they were gearing up to file for full custody again, but this time they were going to claim I was unfit to raise the kids. Now, I know I've said this before, but seriously, Alex barely sees his kids. Fiona has no relationship with them other than trying to play pretend mom when it suits her. And now, they're going to try to take the kids away from me by claiming I'm the unfit one? I couldn't help but laugh at the irony, but at the same time, I was furious. This wasn't just some petty Facebook rant or a no-show on a weekend. They were going after my ability to take care of my kids. My kids. I wasted no time. I got in touch with my lawyer right away, explaining everything Maggie had told me. Luckily, I'd been keeping records of all Alex's ridiculous behavior, from the skipped weekends to the stuff he'd said about Lila not being his. My lawyer reassured me that I was in a solid position, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. No matter how strong my case was, the fact that I had to fight for my right to keep my kids just made me sick. The next couple of days were a blur of meetings with my lawyer, gathering more documentation, and trying to act like everything was normal for Luke and Lila. I didn't want them to feel the tension, even though it was eating me up inside. Every time I looked at them, I felt this overwhelming sense of protectiveness, like I needed to shield them from whatever storm Alex was about to bring. Then, it happened. Alex filed the paperwork for the custody case, claiming I was emotionally unstable and unable to provide a stable home environment. I read through the papers, and the lies were just piling on top of each other. He had the nerve to say that I'd been alienating the kids from him and that I was using them as pawns to hurt him. Yeah, because I'm the one who's been skipping weekends and refusing to take both kids. unreal. My lawyer was confident, but I wasn't feeling so sure. Courts can be unpredictable, and the thought of losing even partial custody of my kids was terrifying. I knew I had to stay strong, though, because if I showed even a crack, Alex would use it against me. A few weeks later, we had our first court date. Walking into that courtroom, I felt like I was about to throw up. Alex was there, of course, looking smug as ever, like he already won. Fiona was sitting next to him, all dressed up like she was going to some fancy event, not a custody hearing. The way they were acting, you'd think they were the perfect family, just trying to rescue poor Luke from his terrible mother. But then, something happened that I wasn't expecting. As we went through the process, Alex's lies started to unravel. My lawyer did an amazing job presenting all the evidence we had, showing how inconsistent Alex's involvement in the kids' lives had been. The texts, the emails, the missed weekends, it was all laid out in front of the judge. And as the hearing went on, I could see Alex's confidence fading. Fiona, too. She started fidgeting, like she knew they were losing. The turning point came when the judge asked Alex why he wasn't fighting for both Luke and Lila. That was the moment everything fell apart for him. He tried to give some half-baked answer about how he didn't believe Lila was his, and that it wasn't worth fighting for a child that might not be his. The judge didn't buy it. She asked if he had taken a paternity test, and when Alex admitted he hadn't, it was game over. The judge didn't hold back. She practically tore into him, telling him that being a father isn't something you pick and choose based on convenience. If he was going to fight for custody of one child, he should be fighting for both. His whole argument fell apart right there. You could see it in his face. He knew he was done. By the end of it, the judge ruled in my favor. Not only did Alex's attempt to get full custody fail, but the judge also ordered him to continue paying child support for both Luke and Lila. It was a huge relief, but I didn't feel like celebrating. This whole thing had been exhausting, and I knew it wasn't really over. Alex would probably come up with some new scheme eventually. That's just who he is. After the hearing, Alex and Fiona left the courtroom without saying a word to me, which was fine by me. I didn't want to talk to them anyway. I just wanted to get home and hug my kids, knowing that they were staying with me where they belonged. When I got back home, I sat down with Luke and Lila and just let out a big sigh of relief. I didn't tell them the details of what had happened. I didn't want to drag them into the mess any more than they already were. But I made sure they knew how much I loved them, how much I would always fight for them. So that's where things stand now. Alex is out of tricks for the moment, but I'm not naive enough to think he's done. He'll probably come up with some new angle in a few months, but I'm ready for him. I've learned the hard way that being a parent means always being prepared for the unexpected, especially when you're dealing with someone as toxic as Alex. But no matter what he throws at me next, I'm not backing down. These are my kids, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to keep them safe from his mess. This story is titled, Kicked Out My Wife and Her Daughter, because I had enough. Before we jump into today's video, I wanted to let you know about my new channel. It's got shorter videos and a fresh style. Be sure to check it out through the link in the description. All right, let's dive into the video. OP starts off by saying, so yeah, here I am, 32-year-old guy, married for a year to a woman named Andy, who I thought was just incredible. She's 34, and I'm not kidding. Up until all this started happening, I genuinely thought I'd lucked out. We met, hit it off pretty well, and took things nice and slow, mostly because of her daughter, Carrie. Carrie's 16 now, but when I met her, she was about 14. And man, I could tell right away she wasn't thrilled about me being there. Which, okay, fair enough. Her dad passed in a car accident 5 years ago, and Andy had been pretty much a single mom since then. So yeah, I knew going in this was going to be a tough sell with her kid. I told Andy from the start I didn't want to overstep or try to act like Carrie's dad or anything. I figured, I don't want to replace anyone here. I just wanted things to go as smoothly as possible. Andy and I decided not to even mention me to Carrie until we knew this relationship was solid. No point in stressing her out unless there was something serious going on between us. It took a while, but eventually we hit that point. And then came the big day I met Carrie. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't nervous, but I was going in with an open mind, hoping she'd at least be okay with me just hanging around, you know? Well, that meeting was awkward as hell. Like, Carrie just stared at me like I'd shown up to steal the TV or something. Barely said a word to me, avoided eye contact, the whole 9 yards. And she wasn't even subtle about it. She'd make these faces every time I spoke, rolling her eyes, acting like she couldn't be bothered. Look, I get it. She probably felt like her mom was moving on too fast, or that I was some guy trying to take over. And I had zero plans to try and replace her dad. The last thing I wanted was to make her feel like I was forcing a relationship on her. I made sure she knew that too. Told her she could just call me by my first name, didn't need to call me stepdad, or anything weird like that. Andy told me to give it some time, and I figured, yeah, okay, maybe she'd come around if I didn't push it. So I tried. I'd do little things, like invite her to come out with us, or ask her if she wanted to go grab some food or something casual. Never forced anything. If she wasn't feeling it, I'd just back off. But man, every time I tried to engage, it felt like she'd throw a little dig my way, say something under her breath, or just flat out ignore me. I'd say something like, "Hey Carrie, you want to go to this new burger place with us?" And she'd just look right through me and say, "No thanks," in that tone. You know? Like I was wasting her time even asking. One time I suggested that maybe we could go see a movie she wanted, and she actually laughed. She was like, "Oh, I don't think you'd get it," with this sneer. I mean, all right, it's a teenage thing maybe, but it felt like she wasn't even trying. Andy would always tell me, "She'll warm up. Just give her time." But sometimes I'd think, how much time do I have to give? Things stayed awkward. I'd see glimpses where I thought maybe Carrie was thawing a bit. Like she'd actually answer a question now and then, without the usual eye roll or sigh. But every time I thought we were getting somewhere, it was back to square one. Like this one weekend, when we all went to Andy's parents' place for a family thing. I thought, okay, neutral territory, maybe things will go smoother. Nope. Carrie avoided me the entire time and made this huge deal about sitting as far from me as possible at every meal. At one point, she actually got up and switched chairs because she thought I was sitting too close. I'd bring it up with Andy, try to talk about it, just to see if maybe there was something I was missing or something I could do differently. And Andy was always like, just let her be. She's been through a lot, losing her dad and all. She'll come around. I understood where she was coming from, but it felt like I was supposed to just stand there and take it without saying anything. And maybe I should have, I don't know. I kept telling myself it would get better, but it didn't. After a while, I was starting to feel like a guest in my own relationship. Like if Carrie didn't want me there, I didn't belong. I kept wondering if I'd ever even have a decent conversation with her without her snapping back or blowing me off. Andy would always try to play peacemaker, but honestly, I felt like she was stuck in the middle, and I didn't want her feeling like she had to choose between us. Now, I know how this sounds. Some might say, hey, it's just teenage stuff, but this wasn't normal. It felt personal. I'd come home, try to have a normal day, and bam, Carrie's doing something passive-aggressive or throwing shade at me. The tension was thick, like I was walking on eggshells in my own house. And every little attempt to make things better felt like it was backfiring. I mean, how do you even deal with that? I didn't want to fight with a 16-year-old. I just wanted things to be okay. Looking back, maybe I could have tried something different. But what? I wasn't going to kiss her or beg her to like me. I wasn't the enemy here. Just a guy trying to be a good partner to her mom. And even though I knew her dad's death was a huge loss, it wasn't an excuse for her to keep treating me like dirt. I tried to be the bigger person, to just let her comments and attitudes slide, thinking maybe she'd grow out of it. But honestly, I was starting to get fed up. How much was I supposed to take? Andy kept saying she'd get better, but I was stuck waiting, hoping this invisible better time would come. And every time Carrie ignored me, every time she threw one of her attitude bombs, it felt like another slap in the face, like I wasn't good enough to be part of their lives. Anyway, I'd convinced myself that once we all moved in together, things would change. That maybe she'd feel more at home and maybe start seeing me as more than just mom's annoying new husband. I'd never lived with a teenager before, so I thought it was just going to be an adjustment period. Thought I'd get to know her better. Maybe even grow close, as wild as that seems now. But if I'd known what was coming, maybe I would have thought twice about getting that serious with Andy at all. Moving in was just the beginning of a whole new level of chaos. And as much as I wanted to believe Carrie would come around, the truth was, I was diving headfirst into something I had no control over. And man, was I in for a rude awakening. So, we finally decided to take the plunge and all move in together. I was honestly hopeful that maybe Carrie just needed more time around me. Like maybe she'd just been feeling like a stranger in her mom's relationship this whole time, and that living together would help break down those walls. I was hoping for one of those moments where we'd all have some big family bonding experience, and Carrie would finally see I wasn't the enemy. But man, was I wrong. The second they moved into my place, it was like Carrie flipped a switch and took her attitude from distant and cold to full-blown hostility. I'm talking about trashing my stuff, giving me the silent treatment, and straight up treating me like I was some invader in my own damn house. She'd ignore me so hard that I'd actually have to double-check if I was even in the same room. It was like she saw me as some kind of threat that needed to be fought off at every turn. At first, it was small stuff, like leaving her dishes piled up in the sink, which I thought was a normal teenager thing. I'd just clean them up and move on because, picking battles and all that. But things escalated fast. I started noticing little acts of rebellion, tiny messes left around just to piss me off, towels thrown on the bathroom floor, garbage not taken out, random stuff like that. I'd mention it to Andy, hoping she'd see what was going on, but she'd just brush it off with, "Oh, it's just a phase, she'll grow out of it." Then one day, I come home from work and head into the kitchen, and there's glass all over the damn floor. I mean, shards of glass everywhere, like a whole set of plates and cups had been smashed. I thought maybe she had dropped something by accident, so I started cleaning it up, but then I noticed some of the pieces looked like intentionally broken. I'm talking about clean breaks, the kind you get from someone chucking stuff as hard as they can. I asked Andy about it, and she looked stressed but tried to play it off, saying, "Oh, she's just frustrated. I'll talk to her." And I'm like, frustrated? So what? She just goes full destruction mode now? But I bit my tongue and just let her deal with it, hoping maybe a talk from her mom would actually help. Well, it didn't. If anything, Carrie just doubled down. She started going for the petty stuff, and it was like she was finding creative ways to make my life hell. She'd leave half-empty cans of soda tipped over on the coffee table, so the drink would spill all over, and then she'd leave it like that for me to find. Or she'd dump a whole bag of chips on the couch and just leave the crumbs smashed into the fabric staring right at me like, "What are you going to do about it?" I tried to tell Andy, "Look, this isn't normal. She's going out of her way to be disrespectful." But Andy would always just sigh and tell me, "She's going through a tough time. Just be patient." Being patient was getting harder by the day. And yeah, I'll admit it, I have a bit of a temper, but I was really holding back for Andy's sake. I didn't want to be the angry stepdad or whatever, so I'd take deep breaths and try to ignore it, even though every time I came home, I had no idea what new mess Carrie had cooked up. And then came the big one. I'll never forget this because it's the day I finally lost it. I'd just come home from a long day, and as soon as I stepped inside, there was this god-awful smell, like something had died in there. I'm sniffing around, trying to find the source, and I finally realize it's coming from the fridge. I open it up, and there's raw chicken sitting out on the top shelf, just out in the open, not even wrapped. It had been left there for who knows how long because the stench was overwhelming. Turns out Carrie had taken the chicken out for meal prep, her words not mine, and just left it there, like she couldn't be bothered to clean up. I called her down, trying to keep my voice steady, and asked her what the hell was going on. She just shrugged and said, "I forgot." That's all she had to say. No apology, nothing. I ended up cleaning it myself, grumbling to myself the whole time, trying not to explode. But then, just a few days later, she topped even that. I walk into the garage to get something, and I find a bunch of my tools just lying around, covered in mud. Carrie had been messing around in there and decided to treat my stuff like it was some kind of playground. I asked her, "Why are my tools covered in mud?" And she just looked at me, deadpan, and said, "I needed them." So what? I finally snapped. I yelled, probably louder than I should have, telling her this was my house, and she needed to respect my things. Andy heard the whole thing and came rushing in, trying to mediate, telling me, "Please, don't make it worse." But at that point, I was done. I told Andy straight up, "This can't keep going. I'm sick of Carrie's crap." Andy looked hurt, but I didn't care at that moment. I'd been trying to be the nice guy, trying to be patient, but Carrie was treating me like I was trash, and I wasn't about to keep dealing with it. Andy promised me, again, that she'd talk to Carrie, and I just laughed and said, "Sure, maybe this time it'll actually work." But the next day, Carrie pulled her most ridiculous stunt yet. I woke up to find that she'd gone into my office and unplugged all my computer cables, just because. It took me half an hour to get everything back in place, and that was when I realized I was dealing with a kid who genuinely didn't give a damn about anyone but herself. This was no teenage phase. This was a full-on meltdown from a kid who thought she could get away with anything. At this point, every little thing she did felt like a personal attack. I couldn't walk into a single room without wondering what new chaos Carrie had left for me to find. And every time I'd bring it up to Andy, she'd just say, "She'll come around. Just give her space." Well, I'd given all the space I had. I was losing my mind trying to keep it together while Carrie was wrecking my stuff and laughing it off. It was only a matter of time before I reached my breaking point. Looking back, maybe I could have done something different. But honestly, I was fed up with always having to be the one keeping the peace. I was tired of feeling like I was just waiting for Carrie to decide I was worth a sliver of respect. And deep down, I was starting to question if moving in together was the biggest mistake I'd ever made. So this is where it all went down, the point where I finally had enough. I had been putting up with Carrie's mess and attitude for what felt like forever, hoping things would eventually get better. But turns out, I was just a sucker for thinking anything was going to change. Because the way she crossed the line this time, there was no going back. It started off like any other night. Andy and I decided to go out for dinner, just the two of us. We hadn't had a real date night in a while, and honestly, I needed a break from the constant tension in the house. Andy was always saying I needed to see the good in Carrie, but I hadn't seen anything remotely good from that kid in months. So yeah, I was looking forward to a few hours of peace. We get back from dinner, pull into the driveway, and as soon as I get out of the car, I see the garage door is wide open. Now, I know I closed it when we left, because I'm pretty paranoid about that kind of thing. And even if I hadn't, it was late at night by this point. Carrie should have been inside, not in the garage. So I'm already on edge, thinking something's off. I step into the garage, and I freeze. Right there in the middle of the garage is my car, my pride and joy, a BMW X5, and it's trashed. I'm talking slashed tires, deep scratches down the sides, and what looks like a broken side mirror. There are even scuff marks on the hood, like someone had been stomping on it. And who's standing there with a kitchen knife in her hand, looking as calm as can be? Carrie. I felt my blood go cold. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. She just stood there, looking at me with this smug little smirk on her face, like she was proud of herself. I managed to choke out, "What the hell, Carrie? What are you doing?" And she just shrugged, all casual, like this wasn't some felony-level vandalism she'd just committed. "It's just a car," she says. "Just a car." I lost it. I'd been holding back for months, letting all her little stunts slide, trying to keep the peace for Andy's sake, but this was beyond anything I could have imagined. I straight up called her a spoiled little brat and told her to get the hell out of my sight. I know I shouldn't have yelled, but what else was I supposed to do? She just destroyed my car for fun. At this point, Andy comes running into the garage, probably because she heard the yelling. She takes one look at the car, and instead of laying into Carrie, she turns to me, all calm, and says, "It's not as bad as it looks. She's just acting out. Don't make it worse by yelling." I couldn't believe it. I'm standing there, staring at my car, thousands of dollars in damage right in front of us, and she's telling me not to make it worse. I looked at Andy, speechless. I mean, how could she possibly defend this? I told her, "This isn't acting out. This is criminal behavior. She needs to face consequences." But Andy didn't want to hear it. She tried to pull Carrie away, saying they'd talk about it in the morning, and that we should all cool off. I wasn't cooling off. Not after what Carrie had done. So I told Andy right then and there, "If you think this is okay, if you're fine with Carrie destroying my property and treating me like crap, then both of you can leave." Andy's jaw dropped. She wasn't expecting me to say that. She kept saying, "You don't mean that. You're just angry." But I wasn't just angry. I was done. Done with being disrespected in my own home, done with the constant messes, and done with Carrie's attitude. I was tired of playing the bad guy, while Carrie got a free pass on everything. I told Andy, if she doesn't pay for the damage, I'll sue her. Yeah, it sounds extreme, but I'd hit my breaking point. I've got cameras in the garage. Everything was on tape. There was no way she was getting away with this. Andy's face went pale, and she started tearing up, saying I was being heartless and taking things too far. She tried to guilt trip me, saying that Carrie was going through a lot and that she'd been struggling since her dad died. I get it. Losing a parent is brutal, but it doesn't give you a free pass to wreck someone's property and show zero remorse about it. I told her, "I'm sorry for what Carrie's going through, but this is too much. This kind of behavior isn't normal, and I'm not going to pretend it is just to keep the peace." We went back and forth for about 15 minutes, me telling Andy that if Carrie didn't pay for the damage, I'd take her to court, and Andy saying I was cruel for even suggesting it. It was like she was so blinded by her loyalty to Carrie that she couldn't see the damage Carrie was causing. Not just to my car, but to our entire relationship. And honestly, at that moment, I realized Andy was never going to see it. I had been fooling myself this whole time, thinking she'd come around and actually stand up for me. But here she was, defending Carrie even when the kid had slashed my tires and trashed my car. I looked at Carrie one last time, and she was just standing there, not a single ounce of guilt on her face. That smug little smirk was still there, like she'd won some game I didn't even know we were playing. That's when I told them both, "Get out! Pack your bags and go." They looked shocked, like they couldn't believe I'd actually followed through. Andy started begging me to calm down, saying we could work it out, that Carrie didn't mean it. But I was beyond caring at that point. I was done trying to fix things when it was obvious no one else was interested in making this work. As they left, I stood there, looking at the wreck that was once my car, feeling more drained than I've ever felt in my life. I'd spent a year trying to make this family work, putting up with so much crap because I loved Andy and wanted a life with her. But when it came down to it, Carrie's actions showed me exactly where I stood, and Andy's reaction proved it. That night, I sat in the quiet, wondering how the hell it had all come to this. I felt stupid for letting it go on this long, for hoping things would change when they never would. But one thing was clear. I wasn't letting Carrie or anyone else walk all over me anymore. This was the last straw, and I'd finally had enough. After they left, I sat there in the silence, feeling a weird mix of anger and relief. I kept looking out the window, half expecting Andy to come back, or for Carrie to storm in with another tantrum, but no one came back. For the first time in what felt like ages, the house was completely quiet. It hit me then that it was really over. This whole year had been this constant push and pull, with me trying to make things work, bending over backward to make everyone happy. But now that they were gone, I finally felt what it was like to have peace. And honestly, it was amazing. I went back into the garage to look at my car. The slashed tires, the scratches, the damage Carrie had done, it was all still there. Seeing it pissed me off, but at the same time, it was like a reminder of why things had to end. I didn't feel guilty for telling them to leave. After everything Carrie put me through and Andy just letting it slide, I knew this was the right decision. There was no going back. That night, I slept better than I had in months. I didn't have to worry about stepping on broken glass in the kitchen or finding my tools scattered all over the garage. I didn't have to walk into a room and wonder what kind of mess Carrie had left for me. For once, I actually felt at home in my own place. The next morning, I started making plans to move on. I knew I'd have to deal with the car situation, figure out if I was going to repair it or replace it, and maybe even file a police report if it came to that. But for now, I just wanted to enjoy the quiet, to actually feel like I was in control of my own life again. As the days went by, I started getting texts from Andy. At first, she was just checking in, asking if we could talk. She'd send these long messages, telling me how much she missed me, how she thought we could work things out, how Carrie was just acting out because of her dad's death. Same stuff she'd been saying all along. And honestly, it just reminded me why I couldn't keep doing this. I'd given it everything I had, tried to make it work, and Carrie kept pushing every single button I had while Andy defended her. I ignored most of the texts. I knew if I replied, it would just lead to another back and forth where she'd try to talk me into taking them back. But I wasn't interested. I'd made my decision, and I was sticking to it. A few days later, Andy showed up at the house. I hadn't answered her messages, so I guess she decided to try face-to-face. I opened the door, and there she was, looking all teary-eyed and apologetic. She told me how hard things had been for her and Carrie, how Carrie was still struggling with losing her dad, and how she thought I was giving up on them too easily. I just listened, but the more she talked, the more I realized nothing had changed. She was still making excuses, still defending Carrie, still refusing to see my side. Finally, I stopped her and told her, "Look, I've put up with this for a year. I've given everything I could to make this family work, and all I got was disrespect and chaos. I'm done." She looked hurt, but I could tell she didn't really understand. She started saying things like, "Carrie will change," and "We can work through this." But I wasn't buying it. I told her, "You had a year to make her understand that she couldn't just treat people like crap and get away with it, and you did nothing. I can't live like that anymore." After a long, awkward silence, she finally nodded and said she understood. I think, for the first time, she realized that I wasn't going to back down, that I wasn't going to let Carrie walk all over me anymore. She tried to say a few more things, but I just told her goodbye and closed the door. I wasn't going to let her guilt trip me into changing my mind. Once she was gone, I felt this huge weight lift off my shoulders. I'd been holding on to this idea of us being this happy little family, but that was just some fantasy I'd built up in my head. The reality was that I'd been living in a nightmare, and it was finally over. In the days that followed, I started putting my life back together. I focused on fixing up the house, getting things organized, making it feel like my place again. It felt like I was reclaiming my space, and with every little thing I did, I felt more like myself. People started asking questions, of course. Friends and family wanted to know what happened, why Andy and Carrie were gone. I kept it simple, just told them it didn't work out. No one really pushed for details, and that was fine by me. I wasn't interested in rehashing every little thing Carrie had done, or explaining why Andy hadn't backed me up. The people who knew me well could tell I was happier, and that was enough. There were moments, though, when I'd think back on it all and feel a bit of sadness, maybe a little regret. Not because I missed them, but because I'd put so much time and energy into something that turned out to be a complete mess. I'd wanted a family, wanted to be that supportive partner for Andy, and it hadn't worked out. But in the end, I realized it was better to be alone and happy than stuck in a toxic situation where I was constantly disrespected. One day, I was cleaning out the garage and finally decided to get rid of some of the things that reminded me of Carrie and Andy. I tossed out some random junk they'd left behind, old clothes, notebooks, whatever. And as I was doing it, I felt like I was really moving forward, like I was closing that chapter of my life for good. Final update. So, after everything went down, Andy reached out, wanting to talk. I'll be honest, I wasn't thrilled to meet up, but I thought maybe there'd be some sort of closure, or maybe she'd finally see my side. We sat down, and she started talking about how we could work through it, and how I needed to just be patient. She wanted me to come back and try again, promising that Carrie would get better, that this was all just a rough phase. But I was done. I mean, I'd already been patient. I'd been giving chances for a year while Carrie wrecked my stuff and my peace of mind, and Andy let it happen every single time. I told her as calmly as I could, "I'm sorry, but I'm done, Andy. I can't keep doing this." I explained that I needed to think about myself for once, that this wasn't just about one incident, but a whole pattern of disrespect and chaos. And honestly, I could tell she didn't fully get it. I think she really believed this could be fixed if I just put up with Carrie's nonsense a little longer. But the thing is, I didn't want to put up with it. I was tired of waiting for a kid who had zero respect for me, tired of Andy constantly defending her, and tired of feeling like an outsider in my own home. So we ended up signing the divorce papers pretty quickly. Thanks to our prenup and the fact that we didn't share finances, it wasn't a messy process. It was actually pretty simple. We just sat down with the papers, signed them, and that was that. No need to drag it out any more than we already had. In some ways, it felt surreal. Like, is this really it? But I knew deep down that this was the right thing to do. The relief I felt was all the proof I needed. Of course, there was still the matter of the car damage. That was where things got tricky. My insurance company wouldn't cover it because apparently vandalism wasn't included in my policy. So all €6,000 worth of damage was on me. Seeing that estimate was like a punch to the gut, especially after everything else that had happened. I told Andy straight up that Carrie needed to take responsibility for what she'd done and cover the costs. But surprise, surprise, Andy didn't have the money, and she wasn't exactly in a position to help. She'd moved back in with her parents and was struggling to find her own place, so her hands were tied. I debated for a while whether I should just let it go, but honestly, why should I? Carrie had to learn that actions have consequences, and I was tired of being the one constantly left to pick up the pieces. So, I made a deal with Andy. I'd cover the cost of the repairs up front, and she'd pay me back monthly until it was all settled. We even got it written up officially, just so there'd be no forgetting or backing out. I wasn't going to leave it to chance. And because I'd filed a police report, Carrie now has a criminal record. I know some people might think that's extreme, but if you'd been in my shoes, you'd understand. She brought this on herself. Maybe now she'd realize she couldn't just go around trashing people's property and expecting no consequences. The weeks that followed were interesting. I'll admit, it was strange at first, coming home to an empty house, without all the messes and attitude waiting for me. I'd grown so used to the tension that it took a little while to get used to the quiet. But the weird thing? After the first few days, I started to feel a lot lighter. It was like this massive weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Any doubts I had would disappear. I'd spent a year being patient, being understanding, bending over backward to keep the peace, and where did it get me? A slashed-up car and a stepdaughter who treated me like dirt. No! I didn't regret my decision one bit. And thanks to all of you here who told me I wasn't the a-hole. I know this might sound cheesy, but your comments actually helped a lot. It's weird to think about, but sometimes it's easier to get perspective from people who don't even know you than from those who do. Reading your comments, seeing the support, the "you're not the bad guy here" messages, it was exactly what I needed to keep moving forward. Every now and then, I'd get a text from Andy. Nothing too major, just little messages checking in, seeing how I was doing. I ignored most of them. I wasn't interested in rehashing anything or being guilt-tripped into second-guessing myself. She'd made her choice when she sided with Carrie time after time, and I'd made mine. Besides, the last thing I needed was to get pulled back into that mess. Now, with everything behind me, I'm focusing on getting my life back on track. I started doing little projects around the house, fixing things up, organizing, making it feel like mine again. It's amazing how different everything feels without all that stress hanging over me. I'm reconnecting with friends I hadn't seen in months, making time for hobbies I'd let go of, just taking care of myself for once. And yeah, it feels pretty damn good. So yeah, it's been a hell of a few weeks, but in the end, I feel lighter. I feel free. I've got my peace, my space, and my sanity back, and that's worth more than anything I could have gained by staying. Here's to moving on. And thanks to all of you who reminded me I wasn't the a-hole in this mess. When my dad married his new wife, I was 12. Mom had been gone for about 4 years by then. I was still getting used to the idea of her not being around, and honestly, it just felt weird seeing Dad with someone else. The new wife wasn't bad or anything, and she seemed okay enough. But things changed when she moved in, bringing her toddler daughter with her. The little girl was maybe 2 or 3, and right from the start, she was like the center of their universe. Suddenly, everything in our house started revolving around her. I was still dealing with losing my mom, so it wasn't like I was super excited to suddenly have this new family thrust upon me. I mean, it was only 4 years since Mom died, and I was still trying to figure things out. I'd catch Dad looking at me, almost like he felt guilty, but he never really said anything about it. We'd just kind of go through the motions of trying to blend as a family, but it felt awkward, like we were all just pretending to be okay with everything. The one thing I had left of my mom, though, was her engagement ring. That ring had been in our family for generations. My grandma gave it to her, and she'd always said it was meant to be passed down. It was the last piece of her that I could hold on to, a bit of family history I could keep close. I wore it on a necklace because it was a little too big for my fingers. Every time I looked at it, it was like a little reminder that Mom was still with me somehow. About a year after Dad remarried, his new wife's daughter, the toddler, was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. I didn't really understand what that meant back then, but I knew it was serious. The mood in the house went from tense to just heavy. Everything was about her treatments, her doctor visits, and whatever else she needed. I'd come home from school, and there'd be no one there because they were all at the hospital. I'd eat alone most nights, hearing the quietness of the house and just feeling more and more like an outsider. Then came the day when Dad sat me down in the living room with that serious look on his face. He told me they'd found an experimental treatment that might help the girl, but it wasn't available nearby. They'd have to stay somewhere else for a few months, and the costs were insane. His new wife's family wasn't in the picture, and they didn't have much savings, so they were looking for other ways to pay for it. He looked at me, all serious, and asked if we could sell Mom's engagement ring. I didn't understand at first. Like, what did that have to do with anything? That ring was mine, left to me in her will. It wasn't just some fancy jewelry to sell whenever. It was like the only thing I had left of her. When I told him that, he sighed, then said something like, "This treatment could save her life. It's not like it's just for fun or something." And I remember just sitting there, staring at him, wondering if he really thought it was okay to just take that away from me. He tried to say it was for a greater good, that it was about saving a life. And I mean, yeah, I get that, but I was just a kid myself, barely 13, and he was asking me to give up the one thing that still connected me to my mom. I didn't know how to explain that to him without sounding selfish, which is exactly what he called me when I tried. I told him I wouldn't forgive him if he sold it, that he'd be taking something away from me that I could never get back. But he didn't listen. The next thing I knew, the ring was gone, sold off for $14,000. 14 grand was all it took for him to sell away the last thing I had of my mom. He tried to talk to me about it later, but I wouldn't hear it. To me, it was like he'd just stolen something that didn't belong to him, something that meant way more to me than he'd ever understand. After that, things got weird between us. I pulled away from him, started keeping to myself more. I'd see him with his new family, with his wife and her daughter, and it was like watching him live this new life that didn't include me. Every time I looked at him, I felt this anger building up inside me. I'd catch myself wanting to scream at him, to tell him how much I hated him for what he did, but I held it in. I figured it didn't matter. He'd made his choice. For a while, I just tried to focus on school and friends, anything to distract myself. But that feeling of betrayal didn't go away. I'd come home every day, see them all together, and feel like an outsider in my own house. He'd already chosen his new family over me, and that ring was just the final proof of it. Even when they'd go off for her treatments and leave me home alone, it wasn't like I felt relieved. I was just there, in this house full of memories that didn't mean anything to anyone else. I stopped talking to him about anything important. If he asked about school, I'd just give short answers. When he'd try to make plans to do something together, I'd brush him off, pretending I was busy or didn't feel like it. Part of me hoped he'd notice, that he'd realize what he'd done and apologize. But he never did. He'd just keep trying to make it work, acting like nothing was wrong. By the time I was getting close to 18, I was already planning my escape. I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. Every time I thought about how he'd sold Mom's ring, it felt like a fresh wound, like he'd chosen his new family's needs over my right to have something that connected me to her. I started saving every little bit I could, planning my exit. I wanted out of there, far away from a place that didn't feel like home anymore. I guess some people might say I was overreacting, but when you're 13 and someone takes something so important from you, it messes with your head. It's not just about the ring itself, it's about what it stood for. That ring was my link to a family I'd lost, a memory of a mom I could barely remember clearly. Losing it felt like losing her all over again, and no one understood that, especially not my dad. The years after my dad sold the ring were strange. I thought maybe I'd get used to it, like eventually I'd be able to let it go and move on, but that just didn't happen. If anything, the anger and resentment kept building up. Every time I looked at my dad, I'd just see the guy who chose someone else's kid over his own, who took the one thing left of my mom and gave it away like it was nothing. And it didn't help that, in those years, I felt like I was just there, a shadow in their new family. I figured out pretty quick that I couldn't depend on him for support or really anything. There were days I'd come home and they wouldn't even be there. They'd be off at a hospital visit or staying with friends near the treatment center, leaving me alone to fend for myself. They tried to set me up with meals and stuff, like they'd leave frozen dinners in the freezer, or sometimes ask a neighbor to check in on me, but it always felt like an afterthought. Like they had their priorities and I just wasn't one of them. And let me tell you, it was hard to shake off that feeling of being forgotten. I'd sit in that quiet house, knowing they were out there trying to save her, and I'd just get angrier. Angry that they'd left me to take care of myself. Angry that Dad didn't seem to care. And mostly angry that this was supposed to be my home. But it didn't feel like one. It was like I was a stranger under my own roof. I decided pretty early on that I was getting out of there as soon as I could. I started working part-time jobs, saving up whatever I could. I mowed lawns, babysat, and eventually worked at a grocery store after school and on weekends. It wasn't much, but it was something. My plan was simple. Hit 18, save up enough, and get out. I didn't want any more reminders of what I'd lost or what he'd done. When I hit my senior year, things got even more strained. My dad would occasionally try to have these father-daughter talks where he'd tell me how proud he was of me, how he knew I was going to do great things. But at that point, it just sounded like empty words. I wasn't some little kid anymore, and he couldn't just patch things up with a few "I'm proud of you" comments. And he never once apologized or admitted he'd messed up. I kept waiting, hoping that maybe he'd say he was sorry, that he'd see the damage he'd done. But he never did. It was like he thought it was all fine now, like he'd just moved on from everything, so I should too. I remember one day he tried to talk to me about college. He asked if I'd thought about where I wanted to go or what I wanted to study. I shrugged him off, told him I didn't know yet. The truth was, I didn't want to talk to him about my future because in my mind, he wasn't really part of it. I was planning to move out, start my life on my own terms, and I didn't want him involved. I'd been on my own for so long, I'd learned how to be independent, and the thought of him trying to play dad now just felt insulting. As graduation got closer, the tension between us was at an all-time high. He kept trying to act like everything was normal, like we were just a regular father and daughter dealing with typical teen parent issues. But we weren't. Not by a long shot. I couldn't even look at him without feeling that same flash of anger. And I think he knew it because he'd look at me sometimes with this sad, almost defeated expression, like he knew he'd lost something but couldn't figure out what. I saved every penny I could from my jobs, determined to leave as soon as I could. I didn't care where I'd go, just that it would be somewhere I could finally breathe, somewhere I didn't have to keep living in this strange shadow of a family. The closer I got to 18, the more restless I felt, like I was counting down the days until I'd be free. The night before I moved out, I remember packing up my stuff in my room, looking around at the walls and thinking about all the memories that I was leaving behind. It was bittersweet. This had been my home, the place where I grew up, where I spent the happiest years with my mom. But it wasn't that place anymore. Not since he'd sold her ring. Not since he'd chosen them over me. Dad tried to talk to me before I left. He stood there in the doorway, hands in his pockets, looking like he wanted to say something profound, but all he managed was, "I know we've had our differences, but you'll always be my daughter." I just nodded, gave him this forced smile, and didn't say anything back. I didn't want to get into it with him, didn't want to drag out the goodbye. In my head, He'd lost the right to call me his daughter the moment he sold that ring. So, I packed my stuff, threw my bags in the car, and left without looking back. I'd saved up enough to get a small apartment. It wasn't much, just a cramped little place with barely enough room to swing a cat, but it was mine. And that meant everything. For the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. There was no constant reminder of the family I'd lost or the betrayal I'd felt. It was just me, my space, and the chance to start over. At first, being on my own was weird. I'd spent so many years fending for myself that actual independence felt surreal. But as the days passed, I started settling into a routine. I'd wake up, go to work, come home, and it felt good. Peaceful even. I didn't have to worry about Dad or his new family. I didn't have to deal with their drama or the constant reminders of what had happened. Of course, Dad tried to stay in touch. He'd call occasionally, leave these long voicemails asking how I was doing, telling me he missed me. I ignored most of them. Sometimes I'd listen, but only out of curiosity. Part of me kept waiting for him to say he was sorry, that he'd realized he'd messed up and wanted to make things right. But that apology never came. It was always the same old, "I miss you," or "I just want to hear from you," like he couldn't understand why I'd left or why I didn't want to talk to him. After a few months, I got my first real job, something that paid enough to let me keep the apartment and cover my bills. Life was simple, and I liked it that way. I didn't need anyone's pity or help. I'd made it on my own, and I was proud of that. It wasn't until much later that I realized just how much leaving had changed me. I was tougher, more guarded. I didn't let people in easily because I knew what it felt like to be betrayed by the ones you trusted most. But even with all that, there was still this tiny part of me that wanted closure, that wanted to know if he ever regretted what he'd done. But I wasn't going to wait around for that answer. I'd spent too long waiting on him to do the right thing, to be the dad I needed. I was done with that. Moving out wasn't just about getting my own space. It was about finally letting go of everything that had held me back. And as far as I was concerned, that was the best decision I'd ever made. I'd been on my own for a while by then. I got used to the peace, the independence, and honestly, I didn't miss them. There was a certain freedom in being able to live without constantly thinking about family drama, or wondering if Dad would ever apologize. I was finally past it, or at least I thought I was. Then one day, completely out of the blue, I get a call from my dad. I'd almost forgotten what it sounded like when he said, "Hi, kiddo," in that awkward, fake cheerful voice he used whenever he had bad news. He didn't waste any time before diving into the reason for his call, telling me his wife's daughter was sick again, that the cancer was back. He sounded strained, like he was already bracing himself for what he'd have to ask, and I knew deep down that there was only one reason he'd reach out after all this time. Turns out I was right. After all these years, he was asking for money. My own dad was calling me, not to apologize, not to make things right, but to ask for a handout to help his new family. He gave me this whole speech about how they were drowning in medical bills, how things were tight, and that every little bit would help. He mentioned the money he'd saved up for me before he got remarried. It wasn't a lot, just a few $1,000 he'd set aside for my future back when I was little, but he was hoping I'd pitch in. It felt like a slap to the face. I asked him straight up why he thought I'd want to help after everything. He stumbled over his words, trying to explain that he thought maybe enough time had passed and that surely I didn't still hold a grudge. He said it was for a good cause, that I had the chance to make a difference. Like this was all some noble gesture, not another way for him to bail himself out of the mess he made. I didn't hold back. I told him exactly what I thought, that he had no right to ask me for anything after selling my mom's ring. I said it was insulting that he even thought I'd consider it, especially after he'd never bothered to apologize. He kept trying to say I was being unreasonable, that I should let go of the past. He sounded like he genuinely believed I was in the wrong for being upset about the ring, and then he started bringing up his stepdaughter's condition, saying how she didn't deserve this and how I should be compassionate. I told him compassion goes both ways. I reminded him how he chose them over me, over my mom's memory, and then acted like everything was fine afterward. He got quiet, which I thought meant he'd finally understood. But no, he just sighed and said, "I wish you could let it go." That was the moment I knew he'd never really get it. Then his wife started calling me. She'd text, leave voicemails, even sent emails, all trying to guilt trip me. She'd say stuff like, "It's not about you, it's about saving a child's life," and "We're family, we should help each other." I guess she thought that bringing up the family card would somehow make me cave, but honestly, it had the opposite effect. Every message just reminded me how they'd thrown me aside when I was still a kid. I was family now that they needed money, but back then I was just an inconvenience to be brushed off. After ignoring her for a while, she tried a new approach. One day, she left this long, drawn-out voicemail about how the ring had saved her daughter's life, and how I should be grateful that it went to something so meaningful. The audacity of it left me speechless. She was seriously trying to twist it like I was the bad guy for wanting to keep my mom's last gift. I didn't even respond to that one. I just deleted it and blocked her number. It didn't end there, though. Somehow, she got the rest of the family involved. Aunts, uncles, even cousins who barely knew me growing up, they all started chiming in. Some messaged me directly, others just posted passive-aggressive stuff on social media about family values and putting others first. It was a circus, and it was exhausting. I ended up deleting a bunch of my social media profiles just to get some peace. One night, though, I got a message from my grandmother. She's usually pretty chill, keeps to herself, but this time, she'd clearly been roped into the mess. She wrote this long, awkward message about how family needs to stick together and that my dad's stepdaughter was going through an unspeakably hard time. I felt bad for her, but I was tired of being guilted. I sent a simple reply, explaining that my dad had already chosen his family years ago when he sold the ring, and that he didn't get to come crawling back now just because they were short on cash. She didn't respond after that, and I could tell it had stung, but I wasn't about to apologize for setting boundaries. Things hit a new low when I ran into my dad's wife in public. I was grabbing some groceries, minding my own business, and she just appeared out of nowhere, standing right in front of me in the middle of the aisle. At first, I thought she'd just walk by or pretend not to see me, but no, she went straight into her speech about how selfish I was, how disgusting it was that I could even think about keeping the money while her daughter was fighting for her life. I was done holding back. I told her that the ring had meant more to me than she or her daughter ever could, and that she was lucky I hadn't taken legal action when my dad sold it. I reminded her that it was my right to keep whatever money I had, and that if she needed funds so badly, there were other ways to get help. She looked at me like I was the devil, muttered something under her breath, and stormed off. I could feel people staring, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to let her bully me into giving up the last bit of security I had. Walking out of that store, I felt weirdly relieved. For so long, I'd held all that anger in, let it simmer under the surface. But finally, I'd stood up for myself. I'd drawn a line, told her exactly where I stood, and didn't back down. And yeah, maybe it felt a little ruthless, but it was better than just sitting back and letting them guilt trip me. After that, things quieted down for a bit. The calls stopped, and I didn't get any more messages from random family members. I think they realized I wasn't going to budge. But there was still this nagging feeling, this little voice in the back of my head that kept asking if I was in the wrong. I mean, yeah, they'd hurt me, and they had no right to ask for my money, but part of me still wondered if I was being too harsh. Maybe I'd just gotten so used to being angry that I'd forgotten what it was like to feel anything else. It was a hard thing to shake, that guilt. Even though I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, I still couldn't help questioning myself. That's the thing about family. They know exactly where to hit you, where it'll hurt the most. And even when you're standing up for yourself, there's this part of you that wonders if they're right. But in the end, I had to remind myself that I'd spent years putting up with their choices, their disregard for my feelings, and I wasn't going to let them pull me back in. I'd finally started to build a life for myself, and I wasn't about to let them tear that down just because they didn't like my answer. So I stuck to my guns, blocked them again, and moved on. At least, that's what I kept telling myself I was doing. After the grocery store confrontation with my dad's wife, I thought things might finally calm down. I'd told her straight up how I felt, and I figured that maybe, just maybe, they'd get the message and leave me alone. But if anything, things only got worse. Within a few days, it was like the whole extended family had decided to form some kind of intervention. Everyone suddenly had an opinion on what I should do and how I needed to make things right. I'd see these random texts from family members I hadn't heard from in years, all talking about how family helps family. A few of them went on about how unforgiving I was being, and that grudges only poison the person holding them. It felt like they were reading from the same script, probably fed by my dad or his wife. It was like they'd turned me into the villain, the person who was too cold-hearted to help a sick child, which wasn't even close to the truth. The worst part was when they started tagging me in posts on social media. I'd see these guilt-trippy quotes on my feed like, "When we're gone, all we have is family," or "A heart that forgives is a heart that heals." I'd roll my eyes so hard I could practically see my own brain. Eventually, I decided to delete a bunch of them. I didn't need that kind of pressure or manipulation. But of course, that led to more drama, with people messaging me saying stuff like, "How could you delete me? You're acting like a stranger to your own family." It got so ridiculous that I just started ignoring everything, but they kept pushing. A few days later, I got a long email from my dad's sister, who I barely spoke to even before all this. She wrote about how family was all we had in this world and that I should show some compassion. She actually had the nerve to tell me that I was too young to understand, as if I hadn't lived through my own experience and had my own feelings about it. It was like no one could see my side, like I was just supposed to put aside years of hurt and betrayal because they suddenly decided it was convenient. But the thing that really set me off was a group message from my dad's parents. My grandparents were always a little distant with me, mostly because they'd been close to my dad's wife from the beginning and thought she'd breathed new life into him after my mom passed away. They basically saw her as a savior and acted like her daughter was just as much their granddaughter as I was. But in this message, they took it a step further. They wrote about how they understood that I was still hurt, but that I needed to let go of the past. They talked about how my dad's stepdaughter was like family and how, as her older sibling, I had a responsibility to support her during this hard time. They finished it off by saying, "We know your mom would want you to do the right thing." That was it for me. That last line about my mom was like a punch to the gut. Here they were, using my mom's memory, something they barely respected in the first place, to try to guilt me into giving them money. I remember just staring at the screen, feeling this mix of rage and sadness. It was like they didn't just take away the last piece of her when they sold the ring. Now they were dragging her memory into this mess just to make me feel guilty. I sat down that night and wrote out a response. I wasn't going to keep quiet anymore. I told them that they had no right to bring my mom into this, that they had no idea what she would have wanted because they'd barely acknowledged her after she was gone. I reminded them that the ring had been mine and mine alone, and that my dad had no right to sell it. I laid it all out, the hurt, the betrayal, everything. And I told them that if they didn't respect my decision to stay out of their mess, I'd have no choice but to cut contact. I hit send and just sat there feeling this weird sense of relief. I didn't know how they'd respond, but I didn't care. For the first time, I'd actually told them how I felt instead of bottling it up. But of course, the fallout came almost immediately. First, my grandma sent this half-hearted apology, saying she was sorry I felt that way, which is the kind of non-apology that basically means, sorry you're upset, but I'm not changing anything. Then, one by one, family members started dropping like flies. People blocked me, unfriended me, and my phone got quieter. I wasn't going to lie, it hurt. But it was also like a weight lifting off my shoulders. I didn't have to keep defending myself or dealing with the constant manipulation. Then my dad showed up at my door. I hadn't seen him in months, maybe a year by that point. I wasn't expecting it, so when I opened the door and saw him standing there, I froze. He looked older, more worn down, like all the drama had taken a toll on him. But the second he opened his mouth, I knew he hadn't come to make things right. "I thought you'd at least have the decency to talk to me face to face," he said, looking around like he didn't really want to be there. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Talk about what? You made your choice a long time ago." He sighed, like I was the one being unreasonable. "I'm doing everything I can to help your sister," he said. That word, sister, made my blood boil. I told him, flat out, that she wasn't my sister, that she was his wife's daughter, and nothing more. He looked at me like I'd slapped him, but I wasn't about to back down. After all this time, I wasn't going to let him rewrite history just because it suited him. "Why can't you just let it go?" he asked, shaking his head. "You're holding on to a grudge over a ring." "It wasn't just a ring," I snapped. "It was Mom's ring, and you sold it like it was nothing. And now you're coming back for more, acting like I owe you something." We stood there in silence for what felt like forever. Finally, he just looked down, sighed, and said, "You're not the person I raised." I laughed at that, a short, bitter laugh. "No, I'm not. I'm the person you ignored for years while you built a new life with your new family. And now that it's falling apart, you're looking to me to fix it. I'm done, Dad. I'm done being your backup plan." Without another word, I stepped back, closed the door, and locked it. I watched from the window as he just stood there for a minute, looking lost, like he couldn't believe what had just happened. Eventually, he turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped. It should have felt satisfying, maybe even triumphant, but it didn't. It just felt final. I sat down in my apartment, feeling this strange mix of relief and sadness. It was like a chapter of my life had just ended, and and I wasn't sure what would come next. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let him or anyone else guilt me into being part of their drama again. I'd fought too hard to get to where I was, and I wasn't about to let them drag me back down. For the first time, I actually felt free. I wasn't tangled up in their expectations or guilt trips anymore. I could just focus on myself, on moving forward. And while part of me would probably always wish things had been different, I knew I'd made the right choice. After shutting the door on my dad, it was like everything finally fell into place. For the first time in years, I didn't have that constant feeling of waiting for something, some apology or acknowledgement that was never going to come. I told him exactly how I felt, let it all out, and ended it on my own terms. And for the first time, I was genuinely done. The silence that followed was almost unsettling at first. After all the calls, messages, and guilt trips, I'd gotten used to the constant background noise of family drama. But now there was just peace. No random phone calls, no passive-aggressive social media posts from distant relatives, no one telling me how I was supposed to feel. Just me, my little apartment, and the life I'd built for myself. Of course, even with all that freedom, the doubts crept in sometimes. It's hard to walk away from people you've known your whole life, no matter how much pain they caused. I'd think back to holidays or random weekends, the times my dad would actually be around, and I'd get hit with that weird feeling of nostalgia mixed with regret. But then, I'd remember the last few years, the constant betrayal, and I'd snap out of it. I'd remind myself that I didn't need them to be happy. Work helped a lot. I threw myself into my job, put in the hours, and tried to build something for myself. And as time went on, I started making new friends, people who had no idea about all the drama and didn't look at me like I was the estranged daughter or the girl with family issues. It was refreshing, and it felt like I could finally move on without the weight of my past hanging over me. About a month after my last confrontation with my dad, I got a message from my aunt, one of the few people who hadn't picked a side in the whole mess. She'd always been a bit of a neutral party, someone who'd send a quick text on my birthday or check in every now and then, but never too involved. She said she just wanted to make sure I was doing all right, especially after all the family stuff. Part of me wanted to ignore it, just let sleeping dogs lie, but another part of me was curious, so I messaged her back, keeping it casual. I told her things were fine, that I was focusing on work and keeping my distance from all the drama. She replied with a lot of "I understand," and that must have been hard, which felt a bit like she was trying to avoid saying too much. Then, out of nowhere, she dropped a bombshell. Apparently, my dad and his wife had hit a financial rough patch. Between the medical bills, their other expenses, and whatever else they'd been dealing with, they were stretched thin. My aunt didn't go into details, but she hinted that they were struggling more than I'd realized. They'd even put their house up for sale, probably to cover whatever debt they'd racked up from the treatments and everything else. Hearing that should have made me feel something. Maybe a bit of pity, maybe satisfaction, maybe even a pang of guilt. But honestly, I just felt nothing. It was like I'd reached the end of a story I'd stopped caring about a long time ago. I didn't wish them any harm, but I wasn't going to go running back to help them either. They'd made their choices, just like I'd made mine. My aunt wrapped up her message with, "I thought you should know. It's still family after all." And that part stuck with me for a while. What does family even mean when they treat you like an afterthought? When they only reach out because they need something, not because they actually care about you? I realized that just because we shared blood didn't mean I owed them anything. Family wasn't just about DNA, it was about people who actually had your back, who respected you and valued you. And that wasn't them. In the months that followed, I put my focus back on the people who had been there for me. My friends, the distant relatives who actually checked in out of genuine care, not out of obligation. I started to see that the family I chose was worth so much more than the one I was born into. My dad and his wife had taken enough from me over the years. I wasn't going to let them take my peace too. Eventually, the calls and messages faded completely. I guess they finally realized that I wasn't going to be their fallback, that they couldn't keep me on the hook with guilt or family loyalty, and I was okay with that. I'd spent too many years trying to be the daughter they wanted, waiting for them to see me, to value me. But those days were over. I was done waiting for something that was never coming. Sometimes people would ask me about my family, new friends, coworkers, people who didn't know the whole story. They'd say things like, "Are you close with your parents?" or "Do you have any siblings?" And I'd just smile and give a simple answer. "No, it's just me." It was easier that way, and it felt right. I didn't need to explain the whole backstory or dive into all the drama. All they needed to know was that I was okay on my own. And honestly, I was more than okay. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was finally living for myself, not constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if my dad would finally come around. I didn't need his approval or his apologies. I'd given myself permission to let go, to move on, and that was all the closure I needed. By the time the year rolled around, I'd created a life that was entirely mine. My career was going well. I had a close-knit group of friends who felt more like family than my own ever did, and I'd finally found peace with everything that had happened. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I'd gone through it all, felt every bit of that pain, and come out stronger on the other side. Looking back, I realized that losing them had actually set me free. It forced me to find strength I didn't know I had, to stand up for myself in ways I never thought I could. And while it hadn't been easy, it was worth it. I was finally living on my own terms with people who actually cared about me. So, here I am now, finally closing that chapter for good. No more wondering, what if? No more waiting for apologies that would never come. Just me, living my life, free from all the weight I'd carried for so long. I may not have the family I once imagined, but I have a life I can be proud of, and that's enough for me.
You're nothing but dead weight in your own house. Jenna's piercing words cut through the air like a dagger, striking at the core of my being. My heart pounded as I watched her face contort with rage, spewing vitriol at my husband, Ron, and me. It was supposed to be a simple family dinner, but the tension had been building for weeks. Jenna, my son Derek's wife, had grown increasingly hostile and dismissive towards us. She had always been a bit of a firecracker, but her behavior had taken a drastic turn for the worse. "Why should we have to put up with this?" she continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "You two are a burden, and it's time you realized it." Ron reached out to her, his gentle demeanor a stark contrast to her fury. "Jenna, please, let's not escalate this any further." But it was too late. The veil had been lifted, revealing the true nature of our once-beloved daughter-in-law. "Don't you dare try to placate me, old man." She spat. "You and your pathetic wife have worn out your welcome in this house." Derek, my son, sat in stunned silence, unable or unwilling to intervene. It was as if he didn't recognize the woman he had married. I couldn't take it anymore. "How dare you speak to us like that?" I said, my voice trembling with rage and disbelief. "We are your family, and we have given everything to support you and Derek." Jenna let out a derisive laugh. "Support? You call leeching off our finances and invading our privacy support? You're delusional." Her words stung like a slap in the face. Ron and I had always been hard-working, contributing significantly to the household expenses and taking care of the chores. But Jenna's manipulation had twisted the truth, making us seem like a burden rather than the loving family we had always been. I looked to Derek, hoping he would step in and defend us, but he remained silent, his head hanging low. Jenna sneered at us. "It's time for you to pack your bags and get out. This is our home, and we don't need you here anymore." As she stormed out of the room, leaving a trail of anger and confusion in her wake, I couldn't help but wonder what had happened to the sweet, responsible young woman we had once welcomed into our family. It was as if a dark veil had been lifted, exposing the true Jenna, cold, manipulative, and utterly devoid of compassion. Ron and I sat in stunned silence, our hearts heavy with the realization that the happy family we had cherished was nothing more than an illusion. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but one thing was certain: we would not allow Jenna's tyranny to continue unchallenged. The next few days were tense, to say the least. Jenna's outburst had created an unbearable atmosphere in our home. Ron and I treaded carefully, trying to avoid further confrontation, but it was clear that the damage had been done. Jenna's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would go from periods of sullen silence to outbursts of rage, lashing out at us for the smallest perceived offenses. "What's the matter with you, Jenna?" Derek asked one evening, his voice strained. "You've been acting so strange lately." Jenna shot him a withering glare. "Don't pretend you don't know what's going on, Derek. Your parents are the problem, not me." "But they've done nothing wrong," Derek protested. "They're just trying to help us out." "Help?" Jenna let out a harsh laugh. "They're nothing but a burden, and you're too blind to see it." Derek shook his head, his frustration evident. "I don't understand what's gotten into you. This isn't like you at all." "You're right, Derek," Jenna said, her voice dripping with contempt. "This isn't the me you thought you knew. That was just an act, and now the real me is coming out. Ron and I exchanged a worried glance. Jenna's words sent a chill down my spine. Had our entire relationship with her been a lie? The tension continued to escalate in the following days, with Jenna becoming increasingly hostile and volatile. She would deliberately ignore us or make cutting remarks, shattering the illusion of the perfect family we had once believed in. It all came to a head at a family dinner, where Jenna's behavior reached a new low. As we sat around the table, she began to berate us, her words laced with venom. "You two are nothing but leeches, sucking the life out of our family." She spat. "You're a constant drain on our resources and our happiness." "Jenna, please," Ron pleaded, his voice shaking. "We've always contributed our fair share. Why are you treating us like this?" "Because you deserve it," Jenna snarled. "You're both pathetic and weak, clinging to your son and his wife for support. It's time you learned your place." I couldn't believe the words coming out of her mouth. This was the woman who had once professed her love and admiration for us, who had promised to be a loyal and devoted family member. But now her true colors were on display, and they were darker than we could have ever imagined. Derek tried to intervene, but Jenna shut him down with a withering glare. "Don't you dare defend them, Derek. They're not worth it." As Jenna stormed out of the room, leaving us in a state of shock and disbelief, I realized that our family was in crisis. We had been blind to Jenna's true nature, and now we were paying the price. But I was determined not to let her manipulate and control us any longer. It was time to take action and reclaim our dignity. In the aftermath of Jenna's outburst, Derek seemed to be questioning everything he thought he knew about his wife. He confided in me that he was struggling to reconcile the woman he had married with the one who had been tormenting us. "Mom, I just don't understand what's going on with her," he said, his voice heavy with confusion and pain. "It's like she's a completely different person." I placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I know, honey. Her behavior has been shocking, to say the least." "I need to get to the bottom of this," Derek said, a newfound determination in his eyes. "There has to be an explanation for why she's acting this way." I nodded, hoping that he would find the answers he was seeking. I had long since given up trying to make sense of Jenna's actions. A few days later, Derek approached me with a grim expression on his face. "Mom, I hired a private investigator to look into Jenna's past," he said. "What they uncovered is disturbing." My heart sank as he began to reveal the details of Jenna's history. It seemed that her manipulative behavior was nothing new. She had a pattern of latching onto wealthy families and exploiting them for her own gain. "She's been involved in multiple scams and fraud cases," Derek said, his voice shaking. "She's even been married before, to a wealthy businessman who she cleaned out before leaving him penniless." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "But how could she have hidden all of this?" I asked, feeling sick to my stomach. "She's a master manipulator," Derek replied. "She presents herself as a perfect devoted partner, but it's all an act. She's been playing me this whole time." As the full scope of Jenna's deceit became clear, Derek's face crumpled with anguish. "I can't believe I let her do this to us," he said, burying his head in his hands. "I should have seen it coming." "This isn't your fault, Derek," I said, trying to comfort him. "She fooled us all with her lies." But even as I tried to reassure him, I could see the conflict written on his face. He had invested so much in his relationship with Jenna, and the revelation of her true nature had shaken him to his core. "What am I going to do, Mom?" he asked, his eyes pleading with me for guidance. "I can't stay with her after everything she's done, but it's still so hard to let go." I took a deep breath, knowing that I had to be strong for him. "You need to make a choice," I said, my voice firm. "Jenna has shown her true colors, and she's not going to change. If you stay with her, she'll continue to manipulate and exploit you, just like she's done to so many others." Derek nodded, his jaw set in determination. "You're right," he said. "I can't let her continue to hurt us like this. It's time to take a stand." As he left the room, I could see the resolve in his eyes. Jenna's web of lies was finally unraveling, and we were going to make her pay for the pain she had caused our family. The road ahead would be difficult, but we were united in our mission to seek justice and reclaim our dignity. In the weeks that followed, the tension in our household reached a boiling point. Jenna's hostility seemed to escalate with every passing day, as if she were determined to make our lives a living hell. It all came to a head when I suffered a minor injury while doing yard work. Nothing too serious, but it left me with a sprained ankle and limited mobility. Jenna, of course, saw this as an opportunity to further torment us. "You know, with your injury, it might be better if you and Ron moved in with us for a while," she said, a sickly sweet smile plastered on her face. "We wouldn't want you to struggle with the stairs and getting around the house." I narrowed my eyes, sensing the ulterior motive behind her offer. "That's very kind of you, Jenna, but we'll manage just fine." "Nonsense," she insisted, her voice dripping with false concern. "It's the least we can do to help out our family." Derek, sensing my hesitation, stepped in. "Mom, Jenna's right. It might be better if you and Dad stay with us for a bit until you're back on your feet." I glanced at Ron, who shrugged helplessly. We both knew that fighting Jenna's suggestion would only lead to more conflict. "Fine," I conceded, trying to hide my reluctance. "If you insist." Jenna's smile widened, but there was a gleam in her eye that sent a chill down my spine. "Excellent. We'll get the guest room ready right away." As we settled into our temporary living arrangement, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jenna had ulterior motives. Sure enough, it didn't take long for her true intentions to become clear. She began to shirk all household responsibilities, leaving the cleaning, cooking, and laundry to Ron and me. Whenever we tried to protest, she would simply wave us off with a dismissive, "You're the one staying here. The least you can do is help out." Derek, caught in the middle, seemed torn between defending us and trying to keep the peace with his wife. "Jenna, this isn't right," he would say, but she would brush him off with a flippant remark. "Don't be so dramatic, Derek. They're just doing their fair share." As the weeks wore on, Jenna's behavior became increasingly erratic and controlling. She would deliberately isolate us from Derek, making sure we were never alone with him for long. It was as if she were afraid we would turn him against her. "She's trying to drive a wedge between us," I confided in Ron one night as we lay in bed, exhausted from the day's emotional turmoil. Ron nodded warily. "I know. She's determined to break our family apart." As the tension continued to mount, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. Jenna's manipulative tactics were pushing us to the breaking point, and I feared that soon something would have to give. Little did I know that the worst was yet to come. Jenna's harassment seemed to know no bounds. As the days wore on, her tactics became increasingly brazen and cruel. "Why are you two still here?" She would sneer whenever Ron and I entered a room. "Aren't you overstaying your welcome?" Derek, to his credit, tried to intervene. "Jenna, that's enough. They're my parents, and they have every right to be here." But Jenna would simply laugh in his face. "Oh, Derek, always the dutiful son. When are you going to realize that they're using you?" Ron and I would exchange helpless glances, our hearts breaking as we watched our son caught in the crossfire. Jenna's behavior grew increasingly erratic and unpredictable. She would go from periods of cold silence to outbursts of rage, lashing out at us for the smallest perceived offenses. "What's the matter with you?" Derek would plead, his eyes filled with anguish. "Why are you treating them like this?" "Because they deserve it," Jenna would shout, her face contorted with fury. "They're nothing but leeches, draining the life out of our family." I couldn't believe the venom spewing from her lips. This was supposed to be the woman who had promised to love and cherish our family, but now she seemed hell-bent on destroying us. The breaking point came one evening as we sat down for dinner. Jenna, as usual, had shirked all responsibility for preparing the meal, leaving it to Ron and me to cook and serve. As we all sat down at the table, Jenna looked around with a sneer. "What's this? You two couldn't even be bothered to set the table properly?" I bristled at her accusation. "We did our best, Jenna. If you have a problem with it, maybe you should have helped out." Jenna's eyes flashed with rage. "How dare you speak to me like that in my own home?" she snarled. "You ungrateful old hag." Before I could respond, Jenna slammed her hands on the table, causing the dishes to rattle. "That's it. I've had enough of you two dragging us down. It's time for you to pack your bags and get out." Derek jumped to his feet, his face flushed with anger. "Jenna, stop this. They're not going anywhere." But Jenna ignored him. her eyes boring into me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. "You have 24 hours to gather your things and leave," she said, her voice low and menacing. "If you're not out by then, I'll have the police remove you." Tears stung my eyes as I watched Derek wrestle with his emotions, torn between defending us and trying to reason with his wife. As Jenna stormed out of the room, leaving a trail of destruction in her wake, I knew that the time for passivity was over. We had tried to reason with her, to appeal to her better nature, but all our efforts had been in vain. Ron and I exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between us. We had endured enough. It was time to take a stand and reclaim our dignity. "Pack your bags," I said to Ron, my voice steely with determination. "We're leaving this house, and we're not going quietly." From that moment on, there was no turning back. We were going to fight fire with fire, and Jenna was about to face the consequences of her actions. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of anger and determination. Ron and I wasted no time in packing our belongings, our hands trembling with a mix of rage and sorrow. "I can't believe she's doing this to us," Ron said, his voice thick with emotion as he folded his clothes into a suitcase. "After everything we've done for her." I shook my head, my jaw clenched. "She's shown her true colors, Ron. We can't let her continue to walk all over us like this." As we packed, we could hear the sound of raised voices coming from the living room. Derek and Jenna were engaged in a heated argument, their words punctuated by the occasional crash of something being thrown or knocked over. "Can't believe you're kicking them out." Derek's voice rang out, laced with disbelief and anger. "They're your family too, Jenna." "They're dead weight, Derek," Jenna shouted back. "They've been holding us back for far too long. It's time we cut them loose." I winced at her words, my heart aching for my son. He was caught in the middle of a war he never asked for, torn between his loyalty to his wife and his love for his parents. As we finished packing our last few belongings, Derek appeared in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. "Mom, Dad, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice heavy with anguish. "I tried to talk her out of this, but she won't listen to reason." I pulled him into a tight embrace, fighting back tears. "It's not your fault, honey. Jenna's made her choice, and we have to respect that." Derek shook his head, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know who she is anymore," he said, his voice breaking. "The woman I married has become a stranger to me." As we headed towards the front door, our bags in hand, Jenna appeared, a triumphant sneer plastered on her face. "Well, look who's finally leaving," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "It's about time you two learned your place." I bristled at her words, my anger rising like a tidal wave. "You're a twisted, manipulative woman, Jenna," I spat, "and you're going to regret the day you turned on this family." Jenna simply laughed, unfazed by my words. "Empty threats, as always. You two have no power here. This is my house, and I decide who stays and who goes." As she spoke, I caught a glimpse of Derek standing behind her, his face twisted into a mask of anguish and conflict. It was as if he were watching the slow destruction of everything he had believed in, powerless to stop it. With one final glare at Jenna, Ron and I turned and walked out the door, our heads held high. We had been forced out of our own home, but we refused to let her see our pain. As we loaded our bags into the car and prepared to drive away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of finality wash over me. Our ties to Jenna had been severed, perhaps for good. But in that moment, I knew that we had made the right choice. We had reclaimed our dignity and refused to be victimized any longer. As we pulled away from the house, leaving our old life behind, I glanced in the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of Derek standing in the doorway, his shoulders slumped in defeat. It was a painful sight, but it only strengthened my resolve. We were free of Jenna's tyranny, and now it was time to focus on the next chapter of our lives. The road ahead would be difficult, but we were determined to make her pay for the pain she had inflicted on our family. The days following our departure from the house were filled with a tense silence. Ron and I had found temporary refuge in a modest apartment, but the weight of what had happened hung heavy in the air. Derek had remained distant, no doubt struggling to come to terms with the fracturing of his marriage. I longed to reach out to him, to offer comfort and support, but I knew he needed time to process everything on his own terms. It wasn't until a week later that he finally came to see us, his face etched with anguish and determination. "Mom, Dad, we need to talk," he said as we ushered him into the small living room. "Of course, honey," I replied, my heart aching at the sight of his pain. "What's on your mind?" Derek took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. "I've made a decision," he said, his voice steady. "I'm leaving Jenna." Ron and I exchanged a glance, equal parts surprised and relieved. "Are you sure about this, son?" Ron asked, placing a comforting hand on Derek's shoulder. Derek nodded, his jaw set. "It's the only choice I have left. Her behavior has become too much to bear, and I can't continue living with someone who treats my family with such cruelty and disrespect." As he spoke, the full weight of his decision seemed to hit him, and his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I thought I knew her," he said, his voice breaking. "But the woman I married is gone, replaced by someone cold and heartless." I pulled him into a tight embrace, fighting back my own emotions. "I'm so sorry, Derek," I said, my voice thick with sorrow. "No one should have to go through what you're experiencing." Derek pulled back, his face hardening with resolve. "It's not just her treatment of you and Dad," he continued. "She's been unfaithful, and I've found evidence of her involvement in financial fraud and other illegal activities." I couldn't help but gasp at the revelation. "Jenna's been cheating and breaking the law?" I asked, my heart sinking. Derek nodded grimly. "It seems her manipulative behavior has been a pattern throughout her life. She's been using me, just like she used her previous husband before me." As the full scope of Jenna's deception became clear, a wave of anger washed over me. She had not only tormented our family, but had also betrayed Derek's trust in the worst possible way. "That's it," I said, my voice steely with determination. "She's gone too far this time. We can't let her get away with this." Derek looked at me, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "You're right, Mom. It's time we fought back and held her accountable for her actions." As we sat together, discussing our next steps and strategizing our approach, I could sense a shift in the air. Derek had finally awakened to the truth about Jenna, and he was no longer willing to be a passive victim in her web of lies and deceit. The road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with legal battles and emotional turmoil. But we were united in our resolve to seek justice and reclaim our dignity. Jenna's reign of terror over our family was coming to an end, and she was about to face the consequences of her actions. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity as we prepared to confront Jenna and reclaim our belongings from the house. Derek had enlisted the help of his uncle, a former law enforcement officer, to accompany us and ensure a peaceful resolution. As we pulled up to the familiar driveway, a knot of anxiety formed in my stomach. This was it, the final showdown with the woman who had wreaked so much havoc on our family. "Remember, stay calm and don't engage with her unless absolutely necessary," Derek's Uncle Tom instructed us. "We're just here to retrieve your belongings and leave. Any confrontation should be avoided." Ron and I nodded, our jaws set with determination. We had come too far to let Jenna's mind games derail us now. As we approached the front door, it swung open and Jenna appeared, her face contorted into a sneer. Well, if it isn't the prodigal family returning," she spat, her voice dripping with contempt. Derek stepped forward, his shoulders squared. "We're not here to cause trouble, Jenna," he said, his voice steady. "We've come to collect our belongings and leave, that's all." Jenna's eyes narrowed as she took in the presence of Tom. "Who's this, then? Your muscle to try and intimidate me." She let out a harsh laugh. "Don't bother. You're not scaring anyone." Tom remained impassive, his years of training evident in his calm demeanor. "Ma'am, we're not here to cause any problems. We just want to retrieve the belongings and be on our way." Jenna's eyes flashed with rage as she turned to Derek. "You really think you can just waltz back in here and take whatever you want?" she snarled. "This is my house, and you have no right to anything in it." Derek held up a hand, his face hardening. "That's enough, Jenna. You know full well that many of those belongings are my parents' property. We're not leaving until we get them back." For a moment, it seemed like Jenna might escalate the situation further, her body tensed like a coiled spring. But as she took in the determined expressions on our faces and the presence of Tom, her resolve seemed to falter. "Fine," she spat, stepping aside. "Take your trash and get out of my sight." As we entered the house and began retrieving our belongings, Jenna paced around us like a caged animal, her eyes burning with hatred. "You think you've won, don't you?" she sneered, her voice trembling with anger. "Well, this isn't over. You'll pay for this, all of you." Derek paused in his task, turning to face her. "Enough, Jenna. We're not here to fight with you. Just let us take our things and leave in peace." Jenna's face twisted into an ugly sneer. "Peace? You want peace after everything you've done to me?" She let out a bitter laugh. "You're all pathetic. You'll regret this, mark my words." As we loaded the last of our belongings into the car, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me. The battle was won, and Jenna's reign of terror had finally come to an end. As we drove away, leaving Jenna's angry shouts behind us, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her standing on the porch, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. In that moment, she looked small and powerless, her threats ringing hollow. We had reclaimed our dignity and refused to be bullied any longer. Jenna's downfall was complete, and she was left alone to face the consequences of her actions. The road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with legal battles and the emotional turmoil of Derek's divorce. But we were united in our resolve to seek justice and rebuild our lives, free from the tyranny that had once threatened to destroy us. As we drove into the sunset, I couldn't help but feel a sense of hope and determination. We had faced adversity head-on and emerged victorious, and now it was time to move forward, stronger and more resilient than ever before.